Back with you on the Newsfeed PM. Thanks for staying on. The South African automotive industry is bracing for a further slump should the US 30% tariff kick in August. Already, the sector has seen declines of 73% in the first quarter of 2025, followed by another of 80% and 85% in April and May, respectively. Well, joining us now is Dr. Paulina Mamogobo, Chief Economist at the Automotive Business Council. Doc, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. The president has urged the industry to diversify, saying that over-reliance on the U.S. Automotive sector could certainly increase the risk. Is this call a valid one at this time?
Good evening, Tabo, and thank you so much for having us. So it's important to buttress in responding to your question that the U.S. has consistently been South Africa's second largest trading partner. I mean, when we look at the automotive industry as well, it's really been a key market for us. So yes, we do acknowledge the importance of market diversification because that's what enables our global competitiveness. But realistically speaking, it's important to highlight that export diversification or finding new markets cannot be achieved overnight necessarily. So already we are exporting to about 155 countries, up from 148 in 2023. So you can imagine that even in our growth, there is intensifying global competition, especially realizing that we're not the only automotive manufacturer and the only automotive exporter. So with these tariffs, it means that while South Africa is hit, another market is equally hit. So the diversification or the pivoting will be done from different regions. Yeah. So that competition continues to intensify. It's not an overnight exercise, but of course it would help if we could have other markets that could actually absorb our products and cushion us in that regard.
Yeah, in terms of those numbers that you just outlined, the recent announcement of a tariff hike hitting us in August, how does it impact those numbers?
So interestingly, it's important to understand that the automotive industry, in terms of the tariff conversation, was hit under a different dispensation altogether. So not under the reciprocal tariffs per se, but under Section 232, which is the Trade Expansion Act, meaning that that's the 25% that actually took effect early on in April. So the numbers that you've alluded to in your opening, the decline of 80% in April, 85% in May, and 85% in June, that actually is the effect of those tariffs. So even if there is a new tariff that's imposed on top of that, which is unlikely because already of the Section 232, still we know that the U.S. market for us will be a difficult market, and we're likely to see that continued decline because we wouldn't be able to be competitive in that market.
So looking to Europe, is that the solution? I mean, the BMW decision to export the new X3 to Europe, welcomed by the president as something that South Africa should be looking at in terms of expanding its footprint.
Certainly. So Europe has been our biggest export market. So in the likes of the US, where we send about 25,000 units, in Africa we send around 29,000 units, and in Asia, round about still 25,000 units or so. Europe has continued to absorb in 2024 over 250,000 units. So it has been a key market for us over the years. And in terms of that export market, it is important for us to diversify and be able to remain competitive in that market. So to your question, is it a market that we need to look into? Certainly, but with that, we need that policy certainty on our side that government can support in that comprehensive policy of NEVs, because the transition in the EU means that if we are to remain competitive in that market, we need to be able to be producing, similar to BMW, new energy vehicles, be it its battery electric vehicles, be it its plug-in hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles on their own. That's the market that the market continues to take up, that nature of vehicles. So we need policy that can enable and support our competitiveness in that market.
Right. 29,000, you say, to Africa. Why is the ceiling so low when we can hit 250K in Europe?
It's interesting. I think it's important to acknowledge the vehicle ownership in the African continent versus the European market. So on average, for example, South Africa as a context, if you can use that, per thousand, we have only 188 vehicle owners. So vehicle ownership in Africa, especially new vehicles, remains quite low. And also it's important to mention as well that the nature of vehicles that would go into the African market, which would be mainly the SUVs or light commercial vehicles as well, they differ because in terms of the variety that we send to the European market, we've got a diversity of those. But it's important to flag that with all these tariffs taking into effect, we saw the 2024 full year figures. We grew in Africa by 1.3%. And just in the first quarter of 2025, Africa actually upheld our performance in terms of a 22% growth. So it shows that the market is ready, there is appetite, but of course, we do need just to also work around the whole finalization of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because that's what will enable and fast track and expedite also trade on the continent itself.
So what are the levers that the president has here, or the government, shall we say, in terms of modifying these particular rates upward or downwards?
Just repeat the question again.
I'm saying the president could possibly, I suppose, in engaging the U.S. or the government of South Africa in engaging the U.S., be able to modify these rates upwards or downwards. So what does it depend on? What are the levers that they can pull on?
Sure, that's a very interesting conversation. So it's interesting also to look at it from the perspective, especially if we're bringing US in this conversation, to say, when you look at the negotiations that are actually taking place, this is a tariff book that Donald Trump actually, even in his initial term, actually had put in place to say he will drive this tariff conversation. So to say, are we able to negotiate around that? We need to also take lessons from all the other deals that have actually emerged, but we are hopeful that we'll be able to negotiate at least downward. The levers that can pull would be what trade-offs actually can we do from a South African perspective. So when you look at the other deals, what the other nations have been able to put forward, they looked at their economic and policy landscape to say, what is it from an economic development perspective can we actually put on the negotiating table? And is that something actually that will enable the growth and competitiveness of their own market? So part of these trade deals that we're negotiating further, I think that should be the conversation, and that would determine to what extent we can actually be able to leverage and beyond we'll be able to get from the US market too.
Maybe let's just, I don't know if you would have that number, that the 25% already on the book you're saying, how that would have affected employment?
So let me put it in this way. The complexity of the automotive industry, of course, is quite broad. So just in 2024, we created about 115 new jobs, 115,000 rather new jobs, and this is from component manufacturing and vehicle manufacturing. So across the value chain as well, we continue to sustain over 500,000 jobs. So when we look at the impact of these tariffs, the conversation then becomes, because our share of exports to the US market, as an example, is about 6%, how does that then trickle down into those volumes of jobs that we've created? And in that regard, a loss of export volume in that market then impacts production and then trickles down into the actual value. So we continue to quantify that, because important to mention, Thabo, as well, is when we quantify the impact, we don't just look at automotives. Our automotive sector has continued to anchor economies such as East London, such towns. So that ripple effects means every other entrepreneur that's in that place as well is also impacted. So the jobs will go beyond just the manufacturing processes, but also to other economic activity in and around the areas. So quite severe impact. So if you look at the numbers that we create, the direct jobs, that's the question that we actually are starting to quantify from. A loss of an automotive job means losing the ability to sustain a household of about 4 people plus. So that's actually quite a severe impact if we look at it from that lens.
Sure. Doc, much appreciated. Thanks for your intervention this afternoon. That's Dr. Paulina Mamogobo there with the Chief Economist at the Automotive Business Council.